Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go, this July 11th edition. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is our video podcast where we talk with our center directors and find out about their latest research, about the latest analysis that they have about state policy, and new ideas for ways that we can tackle our state's challenges better, more efficiently, with more freedom for you to make choices on your own. That's what Washington Policy Center is all about, sharing information, making sure that you're educated and you have the ability to share that information with others. We come to you every other week during the spirit of time, during the legislative session. It's a weekly event, but for the rest of the year, we're every other week, and this just happens to be that day. So welcome to those of you who are signing on, and we'd encourage you to make sure you check out our blog at washingtonpolicy.org. There's always some great new information there. Lee Finna has a new blog posted about a school district that is closing down its special advanced placement education department, basically where kids are accelerating and doing really well in English and math. They're booting them from the classrooms that were specifically designed to get those kids together and allow them to accelerate their learning, and moving them into general education classrooms instead. And this has outraged a number of parents who want to know why it's being done. The hint is that it's part of an ideological move toward ending inequities, which is kind of interesting. It reminded me of, I think, the old Kurt Vonnegut story where you had the society where everybody wanted to be equal. So they just kept adding weights and masks to people to make sure that they were of equal talent in dancing, equal talent in beauty, and everybody looked the same. So you can read that latest post by Lee Finna, because odds are it's also happening in a neighborhood near you as well. Also, we have some new information about some of the rules and definitions that are being presented on the new income tax on capital gains that our state Supreme Court calls an excise tax. And yet the rules are looking an awful lot like income tax rules and definitions. So you can check that out. That's the latest from Chris Corey that you can see on our page at washingtonpolicy.org. Today, we're going to talk about the long-term care tax, but we're going to start with transportation with our own Coles Center for Transportation Director, Charles Prestrud, joins us. This is the first time, Charles, that we've been able to get you on the show. So glad to have you here and to talk to you. One of the things that you blogged about most recently was there's been a lot of talk and a lot of commotion about the tax on carbon, the cap and trade program, creating this big tax on carbon that directly impacts the price of gasoline. Todd Myers has written extensively about that being about 44 cents a gallon. This was something that the Washington Policy Center has been talking about for about a year. And in December, we were really focused on the analysis showing that it would increase gas about 45 cents a gallon based on the projections at the time. Right now, it's 44 cents a gallon. But finally, it looks like there's so much overwhelming impact on price relative to other states that it's getting increasingly hard for public officials to deny the impact that Washington Policy Center described back then. But you point out that this money is not improving our roads and highways. Why is that, and where do our roads and highways fit when it comes to road maintenance and general state of repair?
Well, the short answer is that when the legislature drafted the bill for the carbon tax, they specifically prohibited the use of that revenue for highway maintenance and improvements. So that 44 cent a gallon increase in price that we're all paying at the pump isn't going to maintain our highways. It's being peanut buttered around for a smorgasbord of other things, a lot of green projects, a lot of alternative energy things, and so on. But it is not going towards transportation. That is not highway improvements. And the reason this is a problem is because our highway projects and highway maintenance are funded mostly by the gas tax. But as gas mileage has improved, cars getting more efficient and more electric vehicles, it means they're not collecting as much gas tax revenue, or it's not increasing quickly enough to keep pace with all the highway maintenance needs. And there's a lot of deferred maintenance on the system. So the result is, over years now, the state's been falling behind on maintaining our highways. And in a recent study by the Reason Foundation, they ranked Washington states as 46th out of the 50 states. So we're not doing real well. We're not keeping up with the needs, and motorists see that. If you've driven on I-5 recently, I'm sure you've noticed that it's desperately in need of some fixing.
Well, we had about a 4 by 5 foot gaping hole that they called it a pothole, but it looked more like the kind of those cliffs they used to do in the Looney Tunes. They take out this hole and just drop it on a road, and all of a sudden it's an endless pit. And that's what it looked like on. It
was. It went clear through the pavement on that ramp, and if you'd stepped there, you would have fallen right through.
Oh yeah, there's no fooling around. And I look at that and I think back to gubernatorial debates back when I was, I was a young guy. I can't remember. I think it was the 90s, and there was a lot of talk about road maintenance way back then. And that if we didn't get serious about it, we were going to have various states of disrepair. The bridges weren't ready for an earthquake. They were, the bridges weren't ready. And then we had famously the Skagit Bridge fall down, and a new emphasis on maintenance. Where along those lines, with the earthquake kind of giving us a warning shot, many years ago, and then the Skagit Bridge falling, and then this pothole falling. Was there ever a plan put together to address this maintenance issue? And if so, are they relooking at it, or are they trying to develop a new plan? Where are we on that?
Well, the Washington State Department of Transportation maintenance people are actually very good at what they do, and they understand better than anyone that we've fallen behind, and it's because the legislature just hasn't appropriated enough money to get it all done. And what this does is, when pavement deteriorates to a certain point, you can't easily patch it anymore. It needs a major reconstruction, and that is far more expensive. So by letting it go so long, we've made it worse. The Washington State Department of Transportation has estimated that we need to increase spending on preservation and maintenance by $350 million a year to head us towards where we need to be, what they call the lowest life cycle cost for pavement. And we're not anywhere near that. And the budget that was passed earlier this year doesn't get us there, not even close.
That's what I was wondering. And I know our revenue has grown, dramatically over the last 5 years or so in Washington State. We've had this in over 12 years, even more so. So we've had this huge growth in revenue. I understand that we have these buckets of money. We have the transportation fund, and then we have the general fund. But it strikes me as short-sighted, given that these roads are the economic lifeblood, they're the arteries of our state, that with all this surplus revenue that you still have this massive maintenance gap. It's like driving your car with no oil change, for an extra 30,000 miles and not expecting anything to go wrong. It's a crazy attitude.
In Olympia, this has been framed as a question of priorities. Do we complete the projects, the highway expansions, like the SR 167 extension down to the Port of Tacoma, the SR 509 project, the North Spokane Freeway, projects that have been on the books, that have been in the works for years, sometimes decades? Do we get them done, even though they're billion-dollar projects? Or do we put the money into preservation and maintenance? But framing it that way ignores something else, which is, if you actually look at what the budget is and where the revenue goes, we see that an increasing share of the state's transportation revenues haven't been going to either of those things. They're going to various transit subsidies and all kinds of other projects that really don't do anything to improve the condition of the state highways, or even to complete existing projects that have been on the books. So
you hit exactly on the next point. That was my question, basically, is where is this money going? We have a question coming in. What have our representatives done with all the funds previously designated for transportation, which covers that? And then another question: with record revenues and not adequately funding transportation, is the real goal to get vehicles off the road? Perfectly valid question as well. But those things are kind of all part of the same question that you've just brought up, where we've got this commitment to various transit modes, and you just wrote about the high-speed rail project having some high-cost problems. That again, this is hundreds of millions of dollars that we don't have to waste in the transportation with the transportation needs that we have today.
And unfortunately, it appears that lawmakers are succumbing to near-term pressure for these peripheral and sometimes costly vanity projects, and they've lost sight of the need to maintain the highway system that we have. And the longer they defer those maintenance projects, the more expensive it's going to be to eventually fix them. And the gas tax is not going to be increasing nearly enough to cover those costs.
Do you see that as do you see this as more of a political problem of egos, and that oftentimes for somebody who's elected to office, it's a big deal if you have, it's like the new train phenomenon. You have a new train, it's fancy, it's new, it glitters, that's something easy to point to. Whereas if you just made sure that you prioritized that the roads don't have potholes, it's everybody's driving on the same thing that they take for granted anyway, and there's not the same kind of payoff there. Do you see it as that as being a problem, that legislators haven't made that a priority? After all, they're in leadership here, as well as the governor. Or
I think that's exactly correct.
Issue?
Yeah, you're right on target. Politicians love ribbon cutting ceremonies. They like to initiate new programs that expand the role of whatever agency it is. And unfortunately, that ends up taking resources away from the less glamorous work that needs to be done. Like you say, they don't have ribbon cutting ceremonies when they're patching potholes or doing a repaving job. But in terms of return on investment, those are sometimes the best ways to use the revenue, certainly much better than some of the other projects that somehow get slipped into the state budget. So it is very definitely a question of, I would say, misplaced priorities.
Maybe that's what we need, is ribbon cutting ceremonies to maintain a road, or resurface roads. Just
there's plenty of potholes out there, so they could have a ribbon cutting ceremony every day.
We should just pay the news people. You got to show up, just give them 10 seconds on the evening news for paying to maintain this road. Otherwise, we're all going to die. Let's get this going. Here's a question from Maria. Is it feasible to pair any additional funds to WSDOT with an audit of how the agency spends existing funds?
WSDOT does get audited frequently. The state auditor does that. And there's also occasional performance audits that can be conducted by the state auditor's office. But very often these don't get at the question of priorities that are established by the legislature. So it's a good question. And very often Washington State DOT, like other agencies around the state and around the country, talk about the importance of using benefit cost analysis and being as efficient as possible. But when it comes down to deciding how to spend money, that's done by the legislature, and they're not as interested in that kind of analysis of program effectiveness.
You've answered part of this question already, but it was a follow-up. The legislature appropriates funds to accounts for projects, but to what degree, if any, does WSDOT have discretion in that spending? Are they still advocating for a prioritization system for projects based on environmental objectives? Have they been advocating to change state transportation policy goals in the past years?
Good questions. The Washington State Department of Transportation really doesn't have very much discretion. They have much less than they used to, in fact, because the state budget itemizes the projects that are going to be built. Where the state does have some discretion is in how they use the maintenance budget. But because the needs are much greater than the resources available, it's just a question of chasing potholes around and trying to do the most urgently needed repaving jobs and bridge repairs. So, and they have a pretty sophisticated methodology for doing that. So I don't think there's much more juice to be squeezed out of the onion on reprioritization of maintenance work. That's something that WSDOT actually does quite well.
The next question, this question is about what Democrat-controlled states are managing transportation well, and can we point to them as examples? I'd open it up to, do you know where people could get a list of where transportation is handled well, regardless of who's there? Because I'm assuming unless it's one of those states that's always red or always blue, there's probably a mix of responsibilities there.
Some states do better than others, and oftentimes it's for political reasons, but it can be for other reasons too. And this is not something that happens overnight. Pavement condition is something that deteriorates over decades. So who's in office at the time the work gets done often has very little to do with who is responsible for setting up the funding mechanism in the first place and deciding what projects get built in the first place. There are a number of departments of transportation that are highly regarded. North Carolina is one, mostly a reddish state, though they've had a Democratic governor not long ago. Kansas is another one. So there are good models to follow, yes.
Next question is from Steve. Can a future legislature change the prohibition on spending money for roads and the new revenues from the cap and trade tax?
Yes, they can. And I think there's going to be increasing pressure to do that just because the maintenance backlog is so large and the funding available to complete new projects is inadequate, partly because costs keep going up and because there's been underinvestment for so long. So they're going to have to find the money someplace, and this is going to force tough decisions.
What's amazing to me is I remember the controversy about the nickel a gallon gas tax, because that was going to hit people hard. And then you have this thing where they claim it's going to be a penny, maybe less, maybe nothing, it's just nothing, but it's a 45-cent per gallon hit. I mean, a huge hit in the middle of inflationary times. And it's the denial that that allows them to escape, and the ability to do it without it showing up on the pump itself. So you don't see the tax part, you're not seeing it. It's on the back end, so it's there before it ever reaches the holding tank of the gasoline station. So it's a clever camouflage.
Yeah, and I've heard some unhappy people saying, why is it the price of gas keeps going up, but they're not seeing any improvement in the condition of the highways or city streets for that matter either. Right. And some cities and counties are in even worse shape than WSDOT in terms of their deferred maintenance. And so that's the unfortunate thing about that carbon tax, is that the people who are paying it don't see the benefit. It's getting siphoned off and used for other things.
Yeah, they've basically found an end run around the highway fund to bleed drivers dry of money, because they can collect it every time you go to the pump, and you're stuck doing it because you got to get to work, got to get your family from A to B, and then not actually focus on roads or transportation of any kind. That's
exactly right.
It's frustrating. You also mentioned the state ferry system a while back in a blog where you pointed to a retirement cliff. And one of the things I found insightful about that was you had the pre-COVID retirement cliff. You were pointing out that, I want to say, and I'm just pulling numbers out of memory, but I believe it was like 73% of major ferry staff, of senior kind of staff, were approaching retirement age, I think within 5 years. And then it was accelerated by, of course, the vaccine mandate, firings, and things like that. And so not only do we have a ferry system where we don't have enough ferries to actually deliver the services that are promised as part of our state highway system, but we also have not enough staff to man the ferries that are promised, and we have fewer staff soon based on retirement schedules, if that's not already, part of the happening already. How did that come to be, and should they be training people in-house, to make sure that there's people in place when retirement is within 5 years, or how does that work?
You're correct that the ferry system was aware that they had a large percentage of senior operating staff, ship's masters, first mates, senior engineers, who were either eligible for retirement within 5 years, or in many cases already eligible for retirement. They had their 30 years in, they could walk out the door any day and collect the full pension. They knew that before COVID hit. And then in 2021, Governor Inslee imposed the vaccine mandate, and that caused 132 ferry system employees either to be summarily dismissed or to be forced to retire. And since the ferry system was already facing a shortage of people with the right skills and credentials, that really pushed him over the cliff. So, and those jobs, by the way, are not easy to fill. You can't just hire somebody off the street. It takes years to get the necessary Coast Guard certifications and the years of experience with the ferries, which are complicated. So this put the ferry system in a deep hole in terms of not having enough staff, and they're still not out of it yet. They are working very hard to recruit new staff and to train them up. And unlike the past, the ferry system now pays for some of that training, whereas before it was up to each individual applicant to cover their own costs. But it's going to be a long, hard haul to get qualified people and get them trained up and get them certified. And the ferry system had hoped to return to pre-COVID service levels this summer. Obviously, that didn't happen. They're still short, I think, on 3 or 4 routes, and it's just not going to happen this year.
Was that the kind of hope that you put out there because the public's really mad, and you just say, we're really hoping to get back to this level by the end of the summer? But the reality was everybody knew that you're not going to make that goal because you don't have the resources, and you don't have the staff, you don't have the vessels.
It looked very optimistic to me, and that's the way it has played out.
That's like me when my kids say, are we going to go to Disneyland coming up? It's like, well, we could. maybe we will. But I got some bad news. It ain't happening this year, and probably not next year either.
Yeah.
But
and the other big problem that the ferry system is facing, which you mentioned, is they just don't have enough boats. They haven't added a new ferry, I think, in 5 years. And during that time, they've had to decommission 2 because they were rusting out. And they barely had enough ferries to start with. And it doesn't look like they're going to get any new ones for at least another 2 or 3 years, maybe longer. So it's going to be very challenging for the ferry system, even to maintain a reduced level of service. They cannot afford to lose any more ferries due to mechanical breakdowns in the next couple of years, or else it'll result in further service reductions.
And you say we can't afford to lose any due to mechanical breakdowns in the next few years, but isn't it also true that a number of these vessels are operating at beyond their life capacity, and with the deferred maintenance?
What the life expectancy of a ferry is an interesting question.
It's an artistic question.
The Washington State Ferry System has assumed a 60-year service life, which, by the way, is far longer than the industry standard. I mean, it's that in the European Union, for instance, after 35 years, you take the ferry out of service. That's it.
Let's go take their ferries. Get them over here.
And you're right. They have a number of ferries that were built in the 1960s, and one that was, I believe, launched in either 1959 or 60. So, these boats are either rapidly approaching their expiration date or already over it. And as a result, they're very expensive to maintain and are subject to unplanned breakdowns.
Well, the Biden administration was in town recently, touting our requirement for ferries to become electrified.
Yes.
And I know that you've written in the past on the wisdom of that particular move. But just we've got one quick question here: how many of the upcoming ferries will be battery powered from this point on?
The ferry system plan calls for retrofitting 3 of the existing ferries. Those are the Jumbo Mark II, to be hybrid electric. So they'll have diesel engines and they'll have batteries. And they're going to do, I believe, 1 per year in the off season. They can't do it during the summer because they need to provide them in service. And then the ferry system has been attempting to purchase 5 brand new hybrid electric ferries. But their initial negotiations with the shipyard failed to reach agreement because the shipyard was saying, these are going to be way more expensive than the legislature budgeted. So it was kind of back to square one, and a new request for proposals has been issued, and the ferry system is hoping that that results in more acceptable bids and perhaps revised designs. But it takes a long time to build a ferry. I mean, these are custom items. They're not off-the-shelf parts for the most part. So it's going to be several years at best before those new ferries join the fleet.
It sounds like we're going to spend millions more than we have to achieve an environmental benefit that could probably be achieved with different methods at a far reduced cost.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because when I worked for the Department of Transportation, I asked, the standard measure of effectiveness for this is what's the cost per ton of CO2 reduced? And that's how you figure out which projects are the most environmentally cost effective. And I could never find that information for the hybrid electric ferries. So either they didn't do the calculation, or if they did, the numbers were pretty bad because they didn't want to share them.
I was about to say there's only 2 reasons for that, and my guess is the second, the latter is the reason. Final question for you, because we've kept you over. This is from Tom. He says, State Patrol, as part of WSDOT, has a huge decline in employment due to the vaccine mandate. Any idea where that employment's at today?
No, I haven't seen any recent numbers. Law enforcement generally has had a hard time recruiting in recent years, and I know they're trying to recruit more, but it's tough. They're competing with the sheriff's offices and local police and the federal agencies, and there's just a shortage of qualified applicants. And that's another field, by the way, where people can retire at a fairly early age. So it's tough to keep those positions staffed up. Yeah,
I've talked to some of the guys that are like, why should I stick around? The public doesn't like me anymore anyway. So there's a lot of reasons why officers are saying, the public has to stop second guessing on absolutely every decision that we're trying to make here. It's an ugly business and it's hard. I want to thank you for coming on today. I know you've got a radio interview coming up in about an hour, and you're always a very busy guy, but Charles, really fascinating information that you have. I'm always learning something when I talk to you, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here.
Thanks. All right. So before we turn to Elizabeth Hovde, our Center for Transportation, our Center for Healthcare Director and Center for Workers' Rights Director, I just want to mention very briefly, Heidi commented that the press has been talking about high gas prices due to the pipeline closure and are citing AAA. That's also true. I should have said some press are finally starting to at least accept the idea that, hey, Todd Myers and Washington Policy Center might be right, but many are still accepting too much of the denial on the part of state officials and elected officials who advocated for this cap and trade system, and claiming that there's going to be this massive price, but nobody's going to pass it on to the consumers. It's not going to raise prices anywhere, which makes absolutely zero sense. And anyone looking at it, if they just think about how they buy and sell anything else, if you add a major cost into the production of something, you're going to have to raise your prices. It's just the way it is. So it's a good point. And, remember the Department of Ecology sites, the website was scrubbed of their previous price predictions, which is also a good sign that they know what's really going on. They just don't want to have to say so. So we'll have much more on that, of course, as gas prices continue to climb and Washington State continues to hold its spot as #1 in gas prices above California. So Elizabeth Hovde is our Center for Healthcare director, and she has been one of the, probably the person foremost responsible for publicizing the long-term care payroll tax, for telling people about the opt-out provision. And she joins us now because this is the month when finally, after it seems like we've been talking about it has it been 2 years that we've been talking about the implementation of this tax, or just one?
Yes.
We've been talking about it forever, and it's finally here. We're finally going to see smaller paychecks this month. You won't because you opted out. I will because I couldn't get my individual insurance, because the individual insurance took such a chaotic turn that by the time I called, it was over and done, even though I was within the time frame, but I couldn't opt out. So
sorry about
this,
that. And I should mention that I did opt out. And one of the things that has grated on me the last few weeks is the comment from the state that private long-term care offered wasn't affordable or available to people. I personally got a plan that I don't have to pay into after retirement, like they say you'll have to. I'm a single mom. It was affordable to me in comparison to the state plan. It costs a little bit more, but it's a far better benefit. So that's one thing to watch out for in the messaging that's going on about this program. That should have never been vaulted as a do this program or private long-term care. People have tons of way to invest and plan for long-term care that they should retain.
Yeah, people buy property. They do all kinds of things I've known people, they buy a specific property, like, well, that's my plan for taking care of me when I'm older, and now there's this other one. And maybe for some it sounds out of reach, but people who are careful and plan, they start gathering assets, and there's a reason for it, so that they can leave more to their kids and their grandkids and others, and the causes that they believe in. One of the things you pointed out in a blog today was that there is a new movement afoot by at least some legislators to try to give everybody the option of opting out of this policy. And that made a bit of a media splash today and yesterday.
Yeah. There was a news conference on Monday held by, I think, 5 senators, might have been 4, I'm blanking right now. But they all were in a combined effort to file proposed legislation for lawmakers to consider next session, next January, to make WPC's, the long-term care program and the tax that funds it, optional for all people. You don't have to have a private plan. You don't have to say why. You don't have to do any of that. You just have an option to opt out. It's very similar to an initiative that was filed about, I don't know, sometime recently. 2124 is the name of it. It's an initiative to the legislature being sponsored by 2 different groups. And they also are seeking, there's a little bit different. They seek an opt-in to WPC's, letting everyone out. And if people who are in the program, if they do opt in, eventually they could opt out if they wanted to. I don't see how that works financially. And a lot of people say this proposed legislation would also kill WPC's financially. And to that, Senator Braun said, maybe that's a good thing. If something can't pay its way and people don't want it, it shouldn't be there. So those are 2 different efforts aimed at WPC's, which is, like you said, collecting payroll taxes right now. Representative Peter Abarno has been submitting repeal legislation, and that has gone ignored. I know he intends to file that again next year and hope for that.
Yeah, Braun has a point where with 500,000 people, and I know I'm estimating, but we're pretty close. What is it? The actual number is something like 487,500 or something.
For the private deal, yeah.
Yeah, to opt out. you look at that and you think, when you start excluding the number of people in our state that no longer work and that are kids, you start to get to that is just a huge number of the working people of Washington State saying no already. And then you had a number of people trying to opt out, but the way the opt-out provision, as you've pointed out in the past, it was accidental. They didn't really want people to opt out. But once they were alerted to this, and they started calling around, there was a huge number of people that were still trying to opt out, and then they couldn't. Plus the number of people, who knows how many, who didn't learn of even the possibility on time until, some of them will just learn this month when they open their paycheck for the first time. Maybe they opened it up on the 10th if they're in government, or maybe it's coming up on the 15th or the end of the month. People are going to see this and go, okay, well, what happened to my check here? Why is it smaller? And for people living paycheck to paycheck, this kind of thing matters. Like, it's like, hey, losing $50 is no small affair. When it's funny how that works. When you're cutting taxes, $50 is too paltry to even bother to cut. When you're raising taxes, it's no problem. So when I look at this and see that issue, it does seem like, now that people are actually paying for it, the legislators having that press conference had some good timing, and are getting more attention than they otherwise would have, because it's one thing when you're talking about it conceptually, it's another thing when people are actually experiencing the sting.
And what they're hoping for with that policy is that now that people have gotten a pay decrease, they'll be outraged enough to see that they're probably, in some cases, not going to get a benefit from this program. And the outrage will then be expressed to lawmakers, and more Democrats that have been for this law will get on board to readdress it. And I think some lawmakers will rethink it. I think we pointed out a lot of the errors with WA Cares, and I do think this is primarily a Medicaid saving law, and so that worries me. I think the even tiny save of Medicaid dollars will keep a lot of lawmakers in. Medicaid right now is a safety net built for people in need, and there's a long-term care payment associated with that if you're in need. So the long-term care costs of the state are growing, and by shifting this cost onto workers now helps them pay that budget and look good to HSA, etc. And so I think that's what this bill is in large part about, along with being able to pay family caregivers. I don't think it's definitely not designed in a way that will benefit the individuals for which the marketing campaign says you can have peace of mind. This is going to save you from worry about long-term care. It won't. You might not get it. And if you do get the $36,500 attached to the program, that's not going to be enough for most people's long-term care needs.
One of the questions I've received from people is, when they're asking or they hear about WA Cares, they want to know, what is it? It's a social program. They say it's a payroll tax, but then they're wondering, does it also mean that the government's opening up nursing homes, that the state's running the show on these things? So just for people who are just now waking up to this payroll tax and hearing about Washington Cares, what exactly is this program?
That's a great question, and it has been confusing. And unfortunately, the state did not create a marketing campaign about this tax that was going to assess and the program was going to start. Instead, they made a marketing campaign that talks about why you should like it. WA Cares is a program, not nursing homes, but a program by which you pay in all of your working years to possibly qualify for a benefit of cash that can go toward the long-term care needs that you have and use, such as being in your home and needing meal delivery or help with your pill taking, wheelchair ramps, assisted living communities for some people, nursing home care for some people. So you're given this bunch of cash that can help go toward those needs if you qualify by the state's many parameters for qualification. So the state isn't starting nursing homes, it is giving you money if you qualify to go toward these needs.
Does that work on some kind of reimbursement level, or is it the kind of thing where if somebody did go into an assisted living facility, the assisted living facility would bill the state on their behalf or something like that?
I'm not sure that the expectations have been written completely for that. They have until 2026 to come up with all these smaller nuances, because that's when the payout begins.
Yeah.
You could apply for it under a need-based vestment criteria starting in 2026.
Well, I, for one, will be very curious to see how people respond now that it's actually taking money out of their check. But to be fair too, there's a reason the income tax is directly taken out of your check, because people don't notice it as much as they would if they had to write a check for it. That changes. Yeah, that changes people's attitude.
And my worry in an income tax-free state is that lawmakers are finding ways to fund social programs that would not pass by Washingtonians' approval, and they're adding these things on. We have the paid family and medical leave that's now on your paycheck, and you're paying for something else many of us won't ever need or qualify for. Now we have long-term care, and I'm worried about what comes next.
It's interesting too that there's not, I mean, I appreciate letting people know that there's a problem. And I think you've written about that extensively, where, the one good silver lining of this has been emphasis that you need to pay attention to when you get older, because, it's hard for your relatives if you have no resources to take care of yourself. So you have to plan something to help take care of you. And, and that's a really important aspect of this campaign. But there's also things that can help people delay long-term care needs. Getting healthier, eating better, exercising, stretching, these kinds of things and I say that as somebody who's getting older and understanding increasingly the importance of movement and continuing to move, or
Right.
losing that ability to move. So there seems to be an emphasis elsewhere, in these preemptive kind of strategies, but this is one of those where there's an opportunity for control. Like you point out, there's only, what the state has decided, there's only one way for you to plan for long-term care, and that way is buy a private insurance plan, instead of a lot of people who think, you know what, I'm really good at investing in companies, so I've got stocks and I invest to take care of myself. Or, you know what, I'm flipping a house because I'm a good handy person, and I bought this house. It's got a great location, but the house is totally run down. This is my part of my retirement plan or whatever. But the state's controlling all these choices for people under the auspices of trying to do everybody a favor, but ultimately it's too much for too little.
That's an important point, and they're only having you save for long-term care that you might not get. We have all sorts of life needs, and we have them at different times. There might be other life needs that take precedent over this, and you don't need long-term care, but that's the thing you have money for if you need it. You don't have money for the 10 other things you need money for. So that's concerning. And the other really concerning part about the state messaging on this is that they're sending a message that says, hey, WellCares is great because you're not going to have to spend your 401k or your savings or use your assets to take care of yourself. Basically, better for you to be government dependent and rely on other taxpayers, some who don't make as much as you do, some who don't have resources, and don't save for yourself. It's going to be fine. We've got it all worked out. I just think it's horribly irresponsible, and they might be exacerbating their Medicaid problem with long-term care.
I'm glad you brought that up, because you're right. I mean, one of the challenges, and you have mentioned this before, is they're asking for this. They've created a safety net that requires people who are in need of a safety net to pay out of their paychecks every month for people who have resources and do not need assistance with long-term care. It's a crazy kind of non-safety net safety net.
It's crazy. I've gotten some pushback on that when I say low-income workers will have to pay for higher income workers' long-term care needs. But that's exactly what's going to happen. We've created a safety need for people in need and not need. In some cases, people who have more will be subsidizing long-term care for people who have less. But in some cases, people who have less will be subsidizing for people who have more. And remember, not all of us are going to need long-term care. Right now, the research shows about 7 out of 10 of us do need some sort of long-term care, whether those are in-home services or nursing home care or assisted living. But all those things are going up in cost. And you can bet that the caregiving cost of those 3 avenues is going to go up even higher when people are being given $36,500 from the state that they can pay caregivers with. So this is only going to create I think, inflation in the cost of care. And we're going to be in more trouble, especially for the people who don't qualify for this program because they haven't paid in for 10 or more years without a break, or five or more years. And that's a huge problem, right? You're doing this to help caregivers, not hurt them. And yet a lot of the people who don't work for 10 years without a break of 5 or more years are moms, are people who are caring for their parents, are people who have taken time out of formal work to care for family members. And they're the ones who often aren't going to be qualifying for this benefit.
Well, and I'll point out that the private insurance plans, sometimes you get to pass money that was not used for you on to your kids. So that is not part of that's not part of the program here.
Well,
I guess you could say it's passed on to everybody, but that's a little different.
Right.
I do want to give you a shameless plug. You had a good piece, I thought, in the Herald, the Everett Herald. I just posted the link to that in the chat function. So if you want to read Elizabeth's column that was published in the Herald about a week ago on the long-term care tax, providing taxing too much and giving too little, just check out the link in the chat section there, and you'll be able to see that. And be sure to share it with people who who should be caring about this issue and could stand to read 600 words about what's happening and why their checks are shorter. It's a really easy way to educate somebody really fast. And heck, if they haven't visited too many sports stories, they'll even avoid the paywall, because there's a few stories free on Everett Herald, as there is in most papers, and they'll be able to see that. So appreciate that work that you've done, Elizabeth. It's kind of, it's frustrating to finally see it, but there's got to be a certain point for you, having written about this for so long, that you can at least say, well, at least it's finally here. I don't have to keep talking in hypotheticals here. It's
I
here.
thought about that at the beginning of the month, and then the initiatives and the bills proposed, and you're like, oh no, there's still news happening. But it's good that news is happening. I hope that one of these policy efforts work. And I really think if lawmakers relook at it, they saw the outrage 18 months ago when they delayed the law. However, I think that delay was more about silencing us than making it better for us, the workers of the state who are going to be paying this. So I'm hoping that they will hear that the outrage is still here. People are living paycheck to paycheck, more of them all the time. And we're taking money, and there's no broad-based tax relief to kind of make that okay. And the state has a surplus. So it just is really irresponsible, I think, of the legislature to let workers be taking it on the chin for their inability to prioritize their spending with the state budget.
Yeah, whenever I hear, and not to mention we're in a big inflationary period, where whenever I see a story that says inflation is under control, and I'm going grocery shopping and I pick up the package that used to be about 30% larger with more stuff in it, and now everything you pick up is more expensive and there's less in it. So I find that it reminds me of some of the early campaigns when I was a kid, where somebody'd make the mistake of saying something things were better but they're not. So, don't say it yet unless people are actually feeling it.
I used to walk away with 3 bags at the grocery store or 6 bags for what I get now for 3 bags. And of course, we all know the gas pump problem. That's another. And this is the thing, these taxes just layer and layer and layer on top of each other. So when we're hearing campaigns about, hey, we can pay for everyone's long-term care, it'll cost you less than how many ever coffees they say a day, or things like that. The problem is each of these taxes represents a coffee a day, and I don't buy 20 coffees a day.
Right. And by the way, during an inflationary period or when times are tough, that's the perfect time to cut out the coffee a day, because you start adding it up and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm spending $5,000 a year on coffee, because that's the way little expenses every day just add up and nail you. And that's part of that's why people are getting into the subscription materials on all these various streaming services. You actually have to select which ones you want, because you find out, sooner or later, after $6.99 here, $13 here, it sounds really cheap, and then suddenly you realize, where'd my paycheck go? I've got service choices galore for these streaming things, but I'm going broke. Yeah. So it's.
There still are a few things that the legislature might consider next year, and they're talked about too. Things like making this benefit portable, so people don't lose it if they move out of state, which right now they're going to. Can't retire out of state and expect to keep a benefit even if you qualify for it. But I don't think that's going to happen. This fund is solvent, maybe. Under some scenarios it works, under some it doesn't. And I'm worried about my kids, right? There's no option for them to opt out. It wasn't even when there was a private plan opt-out option. And they're never going to have an opportunity to opt out at this point. They're going to pay in their whole working lives. And if it's not solvent when they retire in however many years, 45, 50 years, 55, is anything going to be left for them? And I just think it's selling a false bill of goods. It's creating false security. It's hurting low-income workers. And we got to hope for one of these policy proposals to make a good policy.
Yeah, I'm watching people do a lot of self-harm in the middle of public spaces on a regular basis as I drive through various towns. And I just think to myself, so the state is adamant that you plan the way they want you to plan for this, but they're not going to do anything about that. That's costing per capita an enormous amount of money in every category for what's happening. But that's a subject for another day. Elizabeth, thanks so much for being part of Washington Policy on the Go. For those of you watching right now, just remember every other week. So next week, no show, but then the following week, we'll be back with more analysis at Washington Policy Center. And we appreciate you tuning in, and we'll post this on YouTube. We hope you'll share it with other people or share a favorite clip of it with people who need to know. And don't forget to share that op-ed in the Everett Herald that Elizabeth wrote on the long-term care tax. Thanks so much for being a part of the program, everybody. And good to see you, Elizabeth. And take care. See you in 2 weeks.